Right, we're going to go back to the OCS here with Reluctant Enemies. Now, a few years back, I did Burma. Find it. It's somewhere over here. I don't see it right off the bat. Maybe it's hiding. Yeah, it's hiding up here actually. And I went into some of my history previously with OCS there, as opposed to my history with OCD. And you can go look at my old Burma videos to see what I had to say, if anything impressive. I doubt it. I did not go over the rules there, and I'm going to do that here. And in fact, in a sense, this is going to probably be my intro to OCS video. It's not going to be linked directly to Reluctant Enemies, I don't think. But there are other people out there who can teach you OCS better, although they may not go into the rules in the same sort of way that I'm going, which is I'm going to be learning. I've read the rules. I've read them, obviously back when I played Burma, but I reread the rules, understand them mostly, but I'm going to stop, I'm going to look at the charts, see what the effects of things are, put my commentary in, just what I usually do. If you want to learn a quick start to OCS, this isn't the way to do it. If you want to dive in from the beginning into the deep end, this probably is. In fact, Reluctant Enemies comes with some helpful little notes there, and it also comes with a starter guide, neither of which I've read. Because honestly, I have played it and I'm familiar with most of the base concepts, so I can't really imagine what I'd want that didn't include the whole rules. And in fact, then they also came up with another starter of sorts, which I also have, which is the second version of Sicily. I should have bought the second version, but the first version goes for a fortune, and I was willing to. It's a situation I want to be able to game, and if I can't do it in the original scale, I'll go to the scale that's more appropriate for OCS. Reluctant Enemies is actually in the Sicily scale. It's half size, by which I mean the distance that a hex covers is half as much as you would expect. Unfortunately, I usually set up games before I do the explanation, and I'm partway through it here, but I've got a few minor decisions to make over here in terms of, hey, within a few hexes of something. Some broader decisions in terms of the French, it's French versus English, get to decide, where to set these pieces up, and they also get to decide on the reserve locations as well. The Commonwealth also gets to decide its reserves. But the hardest of all things, because I've never done a naval invasion in OCS, is I've got these Commonwealth troops that are going to be slamming into the coast. There's some commandos, and I have this whole box to do it in. And it's kind of okay, great. This could be, I don't know if this is a fairly meaningless decision or one upon which the whole game might hinge. Pretty sure that some of the other decisions are a little less vital, although maybe the location of those French troops is even more important. But I really hate when you're given a starter game type situation and you're not given some kind of, here's what happened historically, deal with this. There is a historical commentary in here, and maybe it'll give me some ideas of why the landings were somewhere or another. And this is really kind of outside the intro, but I have to make, I'm kind of thinking I want to go as far forward as possible so as not to lose whatever advantage I might get off these guys in terms of passing this river. But, if I think I can zoom past that river and get to this one, well, then gee, I'd rather be up at the further one. I can't possibly see, given the movement rates, etc., that I'd be able to get up this far. I mean, if my armor could just ride up there, sure, but if it can do that, I don't really need the commandos at all. You know, if I don't need any infantry support. Okay, anyway, that's that. Burma was appealing enough to me that I've been buying up OCS games since then, but I haven't been playing them. And, you know, earlier, I've got everything except for Case Blue, I think. And, well, I don't have DAC 2, okay? But I do have some predecessors. I have DAC. I have Enemy at the Gates, which is sort of a predecessor to Case Blue. I have Guderian's Blitzkrieg, but got such a deal on Guderian Blitzkrieg 2, which is more... Guderian's Blitzkrieg is weird. It's also on a different scale, and it's the first of the games in this kind of... People tell me probably will have a hard time configuring it to play, so, you know, I figured I'd get the second one since it was so cheap. Okay, yeah, like I have space for any of these anymore. I have overflowing my shelving. So, this is an operational game, hence the name of the system. It's World War II set, and it focuses heavily on the logistics. Now, there are aspects of this game, as with certain of the SCS titles, which I can look to and find, you know, games previously that did much of what this does. But my impression is this does it in a cleaner and better fashion than anything else I've seen. I know some people, one of those games that this is derived from is Richard Berg's Desert Fox. And you see a lot of that in here in some ways, especially with the focus on the supply, etc. And I'm sure Campaign North Africa also, you know, was a predecessor to Desert Fox and probably also influenced, at least indirectly. And some people like Desert Fox better than OCS. It doesn't handle the supply in the same sort of I don't know. I'm going to call it an intuitive fashion, because honestly, here you're calling individual supply points around, and you have to deal with all the transport and everything. In Desert Fox, you have to set up a network that delivers your supply points, and you end up doing division and all kind of math, you know, arithmetic that I find actually more cumbersome than the physical mechanics or mechanisms that are in play here. So, I usually gloss over things like scale, but here 2.5 miles per hex, just to give you an idea. Normally it's going to be 5. Your units are pretty standard. Generally what they're going to give you is a combat strength and a movement allowance. As most things, they have their unit designation, size, whatever, type. And then this number in the middle here is generally going to be the action rating, I guess it's called. It's really the quality of the troops, and the higher that is, the better it is. It'll enable you to achieve surprise more often, and it's a modifier on the combat table. And it can affect some other things. These things here are your supply units. They come in different denominations. One of the important factors about them is that one is indeed one supply point, but that's not the smallest. These turn into little tokens, and there's like 4 tokens in a point. What else? Let's see if I can find an artillery piece somewhere. Okay, artillery is a little different. And let's look at what those values mean because I'm not sure. So the big number there in the yellow thing is the barrage strength, and you're going to be using that when you're firing the artillery. Artillery does have a residual combat strength, but I think it's just 1 point with no attack capability. The two numbers all the way to the right, you have your movement allowance again. The two numbers in the center are going to represent, let's see, no. Where? All right, I'm having trouble finding when I was looking at a ship here. There they are. Yeah. So the top number is going to still be your, your whatever it is, action rating, effectiveness. The number below that, though, is the range at which it can bombard. On the back side of units, you have them in their movement mode, where they have less combat strength and more movement allowance. And that's going to be the case with headquarters as well, with artillery, pretty much everything. Okay. You have boats in the game, which in this case have less numbers than they normally would. So here you have a number of different values for boats. The barrage strength, that's still there, and the range is still there, but they have flak points and protection, which are not going to be in this particular scenario. Well, the scenarios of this game. You have transport vehicles. Now these say 2T on them. That means they can only carry 2 tokens. There are larger trucks available that you can assimilate or conglomerate your vehicles into. This would be 2 full supply points. This would be 1. And you can use them kind of like change as you do with the supply points themselves. These restricted markers are specific to the scenario. You have airbase points, which indicate how well developed an airbase is, and you can build those up. Ports have their own value as well. I don't think that's actually covered in this scenario. I don't think the port operations are. It's kind of funny because Burma's a really, really weird OCS example, and then this one, which is kind of an intro, is also pretty weird, and in a way, so is Sicily, Tunisia. Some of the ones that are really pointed out as, well, Tunisia less so. Some of the ones, though, that are pointed out as, hey, these are good starters. This one and Sicily were designed to be starters, and they are very different from the Roots, which are really an enemy at the gates, which is your big east front pushes. Now, I feel like I want it. Two reasons I'm not going with those. One is I'm less interested in the East Front, and the other is I want to do something kind of small so that I can get my feet dirty. And unfortunately, some of the West Front stuff, Beyond the Rhine comes to mind, the Blitzkrieg Legend, these are just so huge because the density of forces in operation versus the space involved is pretty high. I probably should be starting with DAC, actually, but anyway. Especially since it's the one I'm most gung-ho about. But this one's a little shorter. I have a business meeting coming up, a trip for a couple of weeks, so that'll be a problem. Hey, at some point we should get to the rules, right? Okay. Yeah, I've been hemming and hawing and trying to avoid this in a lot of ways. Okay, so your sequence of play, it's an I go, you go type of system, but not pure I go, you go, which is to say there's some reactive elements in it, as there have been since, Panzer Group Grenadier or whatever. At the beginning of the turn, you check weather if it needs to be checked. You see who's going to be the first or first player for any given turn. And then the first player gets to do some things. One is, if they have any airplanes underneath these airbase markers, those are planes that are not eligible to fly, and they can spend some supply and get those planes back. If they have any reinforcements coming on play, they come on map at this point during the reinforcement phase. Then your movement phase. Okay. And they go into some specifics here. So for example, breakout. Hey, if you're caught without being able to trace supply, but you can kind of find a nearby unit that you can trace to, and I might give more specifics to all this later. I don't know how deep I'm going to go into the rules. Then you can make an attempt to attack your way out of the situation, and that's handled kind of abstractly. Actually, you just kind of pop off the map and come back, and it's just one of those weird special rules in the game. But you have to be able to trace a line by which you could have moved. And it's a rule I don't really remember from back in the Burma days. So, normal movement, you move your units as you would in many war games. You can pick up units for your stack. You can drop off units from a stack, but units can only move once. So if you drop some units off, they're not going to be able to move later in your movement phase. They're done. If you pick units up, they couldn't have moved before. And this is important because there are overruns in this game. You can attack while you're moving, and that's actually seems to be a pretty important part of the whole aspect. Now, while you're doing movement, you can do well, you can be moving your supplies around at the same time. But you can use your planes to do fighter sweeps, hip shoots, and transport missions. Fighter sweeps are an attempt to clear the enemy's plane air cover out of your way. Hip shoots are barrages you can do during your movement phase. They won't happen in this scenario again. And then, what was the other one? Transport missions. If you have to paradrop or if you have to move supplies by air, these are the things that, or just shift units, by air. Simulcast turns is an option just to speed up play if people aren't doing much near each other. They're very careful about stacking positioning, because in general you can't paw through your opponent's stack, but there are certain things you're allowed to know. For example, if there's a combat unit in the stack that has a zone of control, or if there's a fighter plane in the stack. And if somebody has to put either a combat unit on the top of the stack, or I believe an eligible fighter plane on top of the stack. And if they have the fighter plane on top, you can demand, hey, is there a combat unit? Show me one. And that's just an element of it. There are different classes of units, and this is something I didn't really explain when I was looking at the units. So first of all, you have the actual unit type symbol, but more important than that, perhaps, is the color of the unit type symbol. So if something's yellow, if something's yellow, then it is a pure armor unit and is to be treated as such. If it's red, I don't know if this applies with artillery. What's this? I don't know what the hell that is. I guess like an armored car or something. If it's red, it's considered to be a mechanized unit, and it has a little less armor capability, which comes into play during attacks. Also, the movement allowance color is of importance. So here we have a yellow block with a red movement allowance. That's going to be a tracked vehicle based on the red movement allowance. If it's got white movement allowance, it's just foot units, and if it's a black movement allowance, it's got trucks moving it. Okay. And that is important because we have different terrain effects charts for movement and for combat depending on these classes. So movement classes are one thing, combat classes are a different side of things, and different terrains work better for different combat classes. Now, this is Dean's solution, the designer, to the idea of combined arms, is that if you want your units to be operable in different terrains, you need to have sort of a mix of units, and that really it's the effect of the terrains on the different type of units that gives you combined arms effects. It's more that you're defensible against certain attacks. I'm not sure I entirely buy that. I'm not a World War II buff, obviously, but if you look at your tactical Napoleonics, you want to have different combat arms hitting at the same time for various reasons. One of which is that the cav attack forces the infantry into a position to which it's more vulnerable to infantry and artillery fire, right? I'm not sure how much of that comes into play in a World War II type situation, though, especially given that artillery is not really going to be a class that's normally used in combat here. Although it would seem to me that if you're forcing someone into a defensive position that's more rigid, then an artillery strike would be more effective against it still. And that doesn't get covered here in any sense of the way. All right. There are also non-combat units, transport points and supply points. Supply points both can be captured basically by the enemy. And there's a table that's going to handle that. There's a bunch of tables here. There we go. Yeah, this capture table, which allows you to capture trucks, wagons, and dumps, because there's different forms of transport points. And Burma has elephants. Some have donkeys. We have ships. We also have planes, which we haven't even really talked about at all. I'm not sure why. We should take a look at some of their factors. See if I can find some. Here's some. Okay, so for the plane, you have a number of different things. You have a type up here. This is a fighter. This is really what it's made up of, which really doesn't matter. Over to the left, the lower left number is air-to-air combat capability, which if it's parenthesized, you can't attack in air-to-air combat, but you can still hurt the enemy. And then to the right is a barrage strength. And I don't know if we have a transport. I think transports may all carry just a half of a regimental equivalent, which is something we should talk about, having to do with supplies, etc. In a number of ways, moving things around, etc. Everything's got a certain weight. And one supply point, I believe, has a regimental equivalent of a regiment. Or a regiment generally has a regimental equivalent of a supply point. But we don't deal in regiments largely, and we deal in steps and stuff like that. So units are going to be assessed a certain number of regimental equivalents, which translate into their supply point size. And that'll be covered in a little bit. Here we go. We got the specifics. Although they change again in the specific games, so in this case, there's different stacking points for the scenario, if I recall correctly. Yeah, we haven't made it very far yet. Okay, zones of control. So an attack-capable unit, which is a unit that has a printed combat strength that's not parenthesized, and there may be other restrictions on it. In combat mode, which is the front side of the counter, will project a zone of control around it. Now the zone has different effects based on the type of movement you're using. So if you're using truck movement through an enemy zone, you're stopped, but they can be negated by leaving a unit behind or having a unit already there that will not move any further that turn. And that allows you then to pass through, to slip through there. Supply lines themselves work rather like trucks do. Rail transportation literally using, I don't know what these are. So these are, yeah, these are also blocked, but not negatable. So if you're running a rail transport network, the zone of control will break that up. On the other hand, if you're tracing your supply on the rail transport, you can negate the zone of control by having a unit there that won't move. Aircraft refit, that can be negated by having units there. You can't switch into reserve mode if you're in an enemy zone of control. You can't switch into strategic mode, and you can't move into a zone of control. You can't rebuild units. Notably, though, you can move into zones of control with foot and track movement. Zones of controls have effect on retreats. Essentially, if you're disorganized and you retreat, you take step losses. I think that's the net result. Okay, back to those regimental equivalents. So a divisional sized unit will have its regimental equivalent shown on the counter. Well, we have no divisional sized units in this game. So let's see if they show it anywhere here. Here's a division, and there you go. There's its regimental equivalent size. We have some designations there. Battalions will be a half a regimental equivalent. Replacement units, which look like this, are a quarter. And those are things that are shared by both players. All other sides count as a single regimental equivalent, but that may depend on the game. And in this game, there's all kinds of changes. Transport equivalents, the SP is a regimental equivalent. So if you're breaking down, one T, token of a supply point is 1/4 of a regimental equivalent, in case you have to figure out what you have. So for stacking, you can stack only 10 REs in a hex, but those are of units only. Supply points, you can put as many as you like in place. Planes, boats, they don't count against this. They have their own limits based on their basing. Okay, and then it goes into this whole how you must stack your units legally so that you don't confuse your opponent or yourself as to what you have there. And in some cases, it's a matter of, is the supply point on board the truck? That kind of thing, where you'd have to put it under the truck to indicate that the truck has it. You put the truck under any supply points that the truck's not carrying. But others are really a convenience to your opponent so that they can scan the board, especially if you're not present. There's a lot of this that's played over at Consim World Expo. And, the turns are long enough that people wander away and take a 15-20 minute break while their opponent's moving, come back and maybe have to be able to answer a few questions at that point. So they're there at the beginning of the movement and at the end of the movement, but there's large portions of the movement where they just don't have to be present at all, which is better than I suffered there. My game, I was out of play for like 4 hours at a time at times. Anyway, they discuss where the markers go, etc. And it's really just a convenience thing. And one of the big reasons for this is you're not allowed to paw through your opponent's stack. But there's certain pieces of information. For example, if there's a hedgehog, you know that that's there. You know if there's a combat mode attack capable unit there. And you know the top active air unit that's in the hex. Obviously, you can't have 3 units on top of the stack, so they go over conventions for dealing with that. Okay. So we've already kind of touched on the idea of mode, where a unit can be in combat mode, or if you flip it over, in transport mode. There are other modes, though. Generally, you change mode voluntarily, I think at the beginning of your movement. Yeah, as you start to move a unit. You don't have to, figure out your modes for all your units at once. You do it as you operate that unit. But if you move the unit, you can no longer switch its mode. It doesn't cost you anything to change the mode. It's just you're set for that turn in that mode unless something weird happens. And for the most part, modes aren't restricted, but there's a limited number of reserve markers in most of these scenarios, and there will be in this one, which is how many stacks that you can put into a more reactive situation, where they're able to either move during your secondary breakthrough type movement, or you're able to use them to react to an enemy's activities during his turn. And the fact that there are so few of them means that you have to be very careful as to where you pick to put your reserves. Okay. So combat mode, your strength is going to be larger. You can't use transportation for the most part, like rails or shipping. Certain units are restricted from ever entering combat mode. Move mode. Move mode seems almost like the default, but you'll often be in combat mode simply because if you're close to the enemy, you want to have your full combat strength. But move mode is significantly faster. Take a look at this foot unit. It's 3 times the speed. And there's a good reason. So I was counting, hey, I could get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I could get to about here with my infantry. Well, actually, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. I could get up to here with an infantry move, if I'm in move mode. Of course, you can overrun, you can fight when you're in move mode, but you may not be as effective at doing so. Reserve mode, I've already kind of talked about that. You're allowed to enter it, and you'll be in either a reserve move or reserve combat mode, which affects how you come out of it. Now, reserve mode units get to move a quarter of their movement allowance before they go into reserve mode, or maybe after they go into reserve mode, which can actually speed up their overall movement allowance. It's a way to squeeze out a few extra movement points if you want. The reserves themselves can be released during a reaction or exploitation phase, and then it'll be allowed to do stuff during that phase, which can include movement in combat. In the exploitation phase, you get to use all your movement, combat, and barrage capabilities. In the reaction phase, you only get half your movement allowance, and you get your full combat ability in overrun, but you're not going to get a combat phase in the reaction phase, because the concept behind that is basically to run units up and stiffen the line. So you can overrun during movement, during any kind of movement. You can't switch into reserve mode when you're in an enemy zone of control. However, you get to keep it if you're already in reserve mode. If you get a defender result, any defender result, when you're attacked in any kind of combat, you lose your reserve mode. You're now doing something. Strategic mode allows you, I believe, to double your movement allowance. And you don't have to be, let's see, you have to be in move mode. And there's going to be a marker for this on the back of here. Here we go. We'll call them markers or whatever. Exploitation mode. So there's two involuntary modes. Modes that you enter into without making a simple decision. One of them is exploitation, and that uses these counters here. And this is a good mode. If you win a combat well enough, you get one of those markers, and that tells you what your RA, effectiveness, I'm going to just call it, but whatever, value is. If your value is as high as what's listed on the counter, then you will get a chance to move during the exploitation phase, and you get half your movement allowance. You can fight in barrage normally. Again, you get this from attacking. So if you win a battle, you'll be able to push those units a little further and maybe fight another battle or more battles. You only get it during a set piece battle. You will not get it from an overrun. Now the other involuntary is disorganized. This you also get from battle generally, but it is obviously a negative effect. And let's see, the different ways you can get it from combat itself. If you retreat 2 or more hexes, you get it. If you retreat into an enemy zone of control, you get it. If you retreat into an enemy zone of control and you're disorganized, the stack that's retreating takes an additional step loss. Everything in the stack turns to disorganized when you become disorganized. And the effects are you have halved movement, combat, and barrage. Your action ratings drop by 1, and you cannot overrun or get to exploitation mode. If you're transport units, you never go into that. You can't use any kind of shipping type capabilities. And special engineers and such are able to operate with their special abilities even if they're disorganized. We're going to have to take a pause and swap batteries, and we've made it through 10 out of 48 pages. But it's not all rules there. And again, I don't think I'm going to go into every bit of detail. We'll see. Okay, let's keep going. Movement, fairly simple or standard. In terms of terrain, if there's more than one symbol in the hex, you use whatever is most costly. And we have a whole variety in this particular game, including lava. I wonder where that is. I guess out here. Yeah, I don't know if that's... I don't know if lava is the right word for that stuff, but okay. And much of it has combat capabilities. Now you have to worry. So, for example, the lava area, which I think is kind of nasty desert, but I don't know for sure, is prohibited terrain to trucks or tracks. But that doesn't mean they necessarily can't move through it. If there's a road, as there is here, and there's some of that terrain in there, they can move in it, and then they can still use it for their combat choice. However, you can see that they do not particularly want to be there. But there might be reasons that they do. Notably, the very close terrain is actually useful, but you probably don't want to take a times 1/2. Okay. Then you have a reaction phase after the movement, if I recall correctly from the We should have a copy of the sequence of play kicking around here. So when you actually move your own units, then you have a supply phase, then you have reaction. And that'll give the enemy a chance to move using the movement rules themselves. Now they can't move all their units. They can only move reserve units that they release from reserve. And I think that's it. Okay. Overrun is an ability to trigger combat during movement. You have to have, well, the movement point cost is not what you'd expect. So you move adjacent to the hex, you declare the overrun, and then I believe you just pay 3 movement points to enter the hex, assuming that it's movable, that you can cross it and you can overrun across it. Now some of these you can't overrun across, even if you can move them. So for example, the one note says no overruns. You can't overrun through the mountain. Trying to see if there's anything else. I thought the rivers had restrictions on it, but apparently not. Which could actually end up being cheaper to overrun it than otherwise. You have to be attack capable units that started the phase stacked together. So you can't pick up units for an overrun. It kind of is going to be tough to remember, but it's 3 movement points for the overrun. If you don't have the movement points, you can't do it. You can only do these moves if entering that hex would be 3 movement points or less. So there's essentially prohibited overrun spaces, like the river here. You essentially are prohibited from overrunning with a tracker truck in that case. And you can't use a road to conduct an overrun. And you can't use a pontoon bridge or anything like that. The overrun's made against a hex. You're 1 stack against that stack. You're not going to get an exploit out of it. If you end up taking any retreat options as the attacker, your movement ends immediately after you retreat. So you're not going to be able to continue moving after that. But otherwise, you'll be able to keep moving after your overrun if you have additional movement points. Any other friendly units in the hex that you're launching the overrun from, stacking limits apply, don't count in the combat. You can't drag them along in any sense. They will not support. Okay, what about combat itself? So combat itself is a little different than normal here. It's got a very specific sequence spelled out here, and it would be very helpful, yay, if there's a copy of it, and there is over where the combat tables are. So the first thing you do is you define what hexes are attacking and what hexes are defending. Well, what hex is defending. In the case of an overrun, the attack is obvious. It's the stack that's moving. In other cases, you have to declare the attack with the units that are involved in it, and they just have to be adjacent. Both players will be able to now expend supply points. Now, the cost for the attackers is 1 talent. Yeah, play too many Roman games, huh? Per attacking step. And for the defender, they pay 2 tokens for the entire combat no matter what. Now that can be paid out of a supply stock that you have access to. And we haven't explained supply yet, but basically if you're near a dump or if a headquarters is able to throw supplies to you from a dump or through other means of getting supply, you can be in supply. You also are carrying ammunition with you, and you can use that, and that's what these low and exhausted markers are for. If units can't be supplied normally, you can use your internal stocks to pay off the supply costs. And the first time you do it, you go to low supply. Second time, you go to exhausted. And there's other cases where you can use these internal stocks. The defender does not have to pay supply, but if he doesn't, his strength will be halved. The attacker can't make the attack without supplies. Then the attacker announces his action rating value. He picks one of his units that he wants to be his lead unit. Now there's a risk to this in that that unit's going to take the first casualty, but you want this number to be pretty high. And then the defender is allowed to choose his own action rating. The defender then gets to choose which terrain he wants to defend in. Now he has the option of defending in, well, he has the option of the affecting terrain for the attack to be either a hexside terrain, like a river, or a terrain within the actual hex. For example, here, this low hills could be the terrain. So if I'm attacking across the river, I could choose, the defender could choose whether to defend at the river line or at the low hills. If he defends at the river, the attacker will be affected by that terrain. If he defends at the low hills, same thing. In either case, the line of combat is going to be based on one of the terrain types in the hex. So even if I choose to defend at the river, I can take the low hills defensive benefit for being close terrain as opposed to open, very close, extremely close, penetrating, whatever. Okay. Passed. I don't know. And no, I'm just trying to be funny in a stupid sort of way. Okay. Then you're going to have to make, well, you compare the two action ratings of the attacker to the defender, and you'll get a modifier. And that's either in favor of the attacker or in favor of the defender, or it's nothing. And then you roll on the surprise table over here. Yeah. Okay. You roll 2 dice, and you add the differential of the two action ratings. And if it's an overrun, the attacker needs a 9 or more to gain surprise, but on a 6 or less, the defender gets surprise. If it's a normal battle, the numbers are 10 and 5, which is to say if you're doing mobile warfare, trying to do an overrun, you're more likely to be in a surprise situation, so your higher quality units are going to have more of a potential advantage. Now, if you get surprise, then you roll another die, and you can roll them all at once. Dean is very good at telling you how to make play more efficient with die rolls. He does this over on CWB, and here he does it quite often. So you roll 2 dice, and then one die for the effect. So if you have surprise, that extra die is going to be how many column shifts you get in your favor in surprise. Boy, that sounds extreme, right? But the combat chart is actually fairly gradual, and the actual effects of those column shifts may not be as great as they seem. But still, assuming you get a 6 roll, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I could go from 1 to 1 to 12 to 1 in very close terrain. Well, you know, that's a pretty big sounding difference, right? If you're used to 12 to 1, you know, attacks, most charts kind of run out before that, around 6 to 1 or whatever, but still, it sounds like a pretty extreme difference. Have no fear, it's not as bad as it sounds, but it can be pretty extreme. And then what you're going to do is you actually roll the combat itself. And for that, you're going to roll 2 dice. And let's see if we can find the combat modifiers. I think the only modifier is that action rating difference. Okay, so not only does it determine the surprise effect, but it's also going to determine whether you are going high on the table numbers, in which case you're going to be doing more damage, not just to the defender, if you look at this chart. So what you'll see here is that the results tend to be, especially on the high end, fairly moderate to both sides at the on a lower die roll at the high end of odds, and as you go further, both sides start taking more losses. A very very much the kind of combat chart you see in SPI's World War One, in terms of what the effects are. But they do skew in favor. So, for example, here, attacker eliminates 2, but the defender loses 2, and then they have an option for 3. That's a lot of effects here, and then they get a disorder. The actual explanation of the results is here. Oh no, this isn't attacker eliminated. That's okay, so I lied. The result there is actually a good one. It's an attacker exploits 2, which means they'd get the 2 exploitation value here. And just forget what I was saying. See, this is why my rules are different, explanations are different from anyone else's, because I don't know the system and I'm learning it along with you. Yes, I've read it, but so that's actually a good result. It's not a bad result against the attacker. And then the attacker will have to take his results first, and then the defender will have to take results based on what the attacker took. In particular, if the attacker takes a retreat option and doesn't continue the attack, or I think if all their units are eliminated, the defender doesn't have to take any optional results at all. They don't have to make a choice between retreating or taking further casualties. So, if the defender's hex is vacant, the attacker can take the extra hex. Some people complain about this, and there's an optional rule to handle this, which is, hey, how come when I'm attacking I get to get an extra hex of movement? That's a pretty common thing in most games, so it's kind of strange that but that OCS players are like not willing to just accept that. Okay. So now one key thing that I didn't mention is which of these rows you're going to choose your odds on, and that's based on the defender's choice of the main terrain in the hex. So for example, if they take close, you'll be using the close line here. And this is what reminds me a good deal of Desert Fox, although in that game it was based on, I think, no, it was based on the terrain. Yeah, you took the terrain, cross-referenced it to the odds, and then the result actually was shifted by columns by the die roll, and then it was ordered by the tactical quality, as it were, of the units. It's not the same system at all, but it's got about that same level of complexity to it, with the die roll for surprise shifting the odds around quite a bit, and potentially, and stuff like that. Okay, what do the actual results mean? Well, so first of all, if you get an O, like here, you have defender lose 1, option 2. The defender has the option to take losses as steps, or they can take them as hexes of retreat. And remember, you get disordered if you retreat 2 or more hexes. So, you might want to take an extra step loss to only get a 1 hex retreat or something like that. Or if you're in good terrain, you may want to stand. Now, what about step losses themselves? Those step losses, many smaller units only have 1 step. They'll be destroyed. Other units, and there may not be any such in this scenario, you put this little skull marker on to indicate that they've taken a step loss. All right, what does that do? Well, first of all, the first step loss has to come from the lead unit in the attack. Everything has to take a step loss before the next unit takes a second step loss. And that's not going to be an issue here, but okay. Now the step loss is going to have an effect on the combat strength, and in the basic game you take that by halving the combat strength of the unit when attacking if they've taken any step losses. If they've taken half or more of their steps lost, then they're also halved in defense. However, somewhere here, and I don't know if it's on this or in some other place, there is an optional rule it's not this. I don't know. There's an optional rule that allows you to proportionally, here we go, isn't it? No. That allows you to proportion the losses that you take. So if you have a lot of if you have some big step units, you'd actually proportionally rank the losses based on the damage that you've taken on those units. We're not going to do that here because everything's one step, but it might be. See, it's going to change the game. I wish I could find the chart because it's going to significantly change. I think if it's truly a proportional loss system, which I think it is, it's going to change how much the advantage to the attack to the defender is in terms of if you've already got a weakened unit, you don't necessarily take any combat effect off your step losses. Depends on how big you are. Okay, the actual retreats. Fairly standard here. You retreat locally away from the enemy, and you must end as far away as your retreat hexes that you're required to take. But you're allowed to kind of try to avoid an enemy zone of control. It can't take you further out of, it can't end up zigzagging your way and ending up that you're not as far away as you should be. You can bring along organic trucks and combat units that were in your hex but weren't involved in the fight. And as I said, if you go through an enemy zone of control during a retreat, you'll become disorganized. If you were already disorganized, you take an extra step loss for the stack that's retreating that way. You could split up on a retreat, but that makes you more vulnerable in some ways. And then after you retreat, the attacker is allowed to advance with units that actually were present in the combat. If the attacker took an option to retreat, they're not going to be able to advance, and they won't be in the right hex, among other things, to do it. If you did an overrun, you must advance into the enemy's hex. And if you move into an area with ships, aircraft, or non-combat units, you might capture or destroy them. Now, some of the results give an E, and as I said, you get this little marker here, and that makes you eligible perhaps to move and fight again in the exploitation phase, if you have enough a high enough quality unit. However, you cannot get an exploit if the attacker is in disordered, for the units that are, if you're overrunning, if it's already the exploitation phase, or, and this is really the weird one, if two attacking stacks are hitting from different directions. Basically, the only time you can get an exploit is if you're in one stack attacking, or if you're in two stacks that are both adjacent, to each other. If you are attacking from more than two directions, or those two directions aren't adjacent, you will not be eligible for an exploitation. Too much confusion or whatever. If you're attacking units with a 0 strength, there's all kind of special rules for that. Essentially, you use, the biggest odds chart that you can. But you could also attack with a 0 strength, in which case you use the least. If you attack with 0 strength units against 0 strength units, you call it 1-to-1. A little weird, but I don't know why. It seems so unlikely that you'd be attacking with 0 strength units, but of course you would know that there's no combat effective unit in that stack. So it's not that unreasonable to try it. It seems more reasonable than attacking at 1 to 5 odds or whatever. If you attack where a dump is, you're going to have to roll on. There's some kind of capture table. Yeah, where you capture dumps, trucks, wagons, and you get a percentage of what's there. Now, the only trucks that can tag along are organic trucks, which doesn't mean that they're, grown out of vegetables. What it means is that they're actually part of the organization that they belong to. So, I don't know. I don't think there are any in this scenario, but basically, some divisions or whatever will have organic trucks to them. Those can retreat, but your normal transport units can't retreat, and some percentage would be captured. The rest are destroyed. Hedgehogs. When you capture a hedgehog by an attack-capable unit, moving into its hex. Air bases, you can capture them as well. If you move into a hex containing enemy ships, they're destroyed. If you take a port, you capture the port, and then you can use it yourself. And I think it's time for another break. I would like to finish. See, the problem is it all kind of links together, and there's a lot, but I would like to at least go through the barrages. Well, let's go through the basis of the barrages, and then I'll pause. So, with a barrage, you use the barrage table. And you total up the strength that you have there, and you get a result. And generally what you're aiming for is to get a disorganized result on the enemy. Although you might actually cause a step loss. And I believe you get the disorganized. Yeah, you disorganize the unit no matter what, if you're getting a numeric result there. Now, in order to do an artillery barrage, for artillery, they have to pay for the barrage, and they're going to have to pay the cost listed on the table. Now, there's modifiers to a barrage. So let's see. So, terrain, the hedgehog can do it. The terrain type can do it. The closer the terrain, the better the barrage. The worse the barrage is going to be. You have more ground cover. But if you don't have a spotter adjacent to the target hex, you're going to take a penalty. And certain kinds of barrages require a spotter anyway. If you're using if you're attacking a strat mode unit, i.e. something that's in the strategic movement, you get 3 column shifts in your favor because they're not taking advantage of the terrain in any way. Okay, there's a bonus for aircraft striking if they're close to their home base. And then there's also a potential penalty if they're far away as an option. And here, the number of steps, the number of regimental equivalents in a hex causes additional shifts. The more units there, the more likely you're going to get a successful barrage. Air and ship barrages don't cost supply directly. Air units are going to have to be refitted after their mission, so they will cost you supply, but the artillery barrages cost supply. You can't mix them, and you can only barrage each hex once in a given phase in general. There are exceptions to that, airplane hip shoots, which will not exist in this scenario. Okay. Then, as I said, there's an exploitation phase. Well, we should go into this too. All right, we'll stop before supply, though. The units that are marked with an exploit mode and that have the appropriate quality are allowed to move and fight in this phase, as are any reserves that you release to do this. And it's, I believe, half movement, but combat ability is the same as normal. The phasing player gets to release his reserves. He doesn't have to. Oh no, I'm sorry. Released reserves get to use their full movement allowance during this phase. They only get half their movement allowance if they're doing the reaction movement. And you're allowed to use ships and active aircraft. There's an option to allow you to use artillery in this phase as well. Again, I'm not sure which options I'm going to actually play with. And that'll be it. Now I'm going to load these up in pieces. So this is going to be the first part of the OCS rules.